Okay. So it seems to me an important place to start would probably be trying to understand, have some idea what he means by duration. So why don't we talk about that? What does he mean by duration, and how is that different from a more conventional way of thinking about self and consciousness?
So duration for him, I think his whole philosophy is pretty much an articulation of this concept of duration. And so he uses a lot of these dualistic contrasts to make his point. And essentially his biggest differentiation that he uses is this idea of a kind of lived experience of time that is duration, as opposed to the abstract scientific concept of time that's like a clock time. So it's difficult to talk about in precise terms because it's not something that can be mathematically defined or whatnot. It's more the lived intuitive experience, the flow of time as it's occurring. But it's not just simply the present, because he's very meticulous to point out that it's the past being preserved and almost kind of like folding back into the present and propelling it in this continuous flow into the future. So it's continuous. It can't be broken up into segments, and also it's constantly differentiating itself as it goes along through the accumulation of memory that leads to these differential states in the future, in the present. And that's different from the idea of clock time, and that clock time uses homogeneous, the same segments no matter what. A second isn't necessarily different from any other second in terms of clock time, where he says the exact opposite. No, it's heterogeneous, so that each moment of duration, first of all, you can only break it up in a kind of abstract way, but the continuous process of duration is a continuous process of just that differentiation. So that's kind of the way I see his idea of duration. But in this case, in this book, he wants to apply this concept to life in general and show that life is actually is itself a sort of duration. So yeah.
On page 8, he kind of gives a lot of credence to that, I guess, making the differentiation between like a scientific view versus like a lived duration of time, thinking about it in terms of like intervals. And he says, toward the bottom, all our belief in objects, all our operations on the systems that science isolates, rest in fact on the idea that time does not bite into them. And then a little bit further on top of 9, he says, abstract time T is attributed by science to a material object or to an isolated system, consist only in a certain number of simultaneities, or more generally of correspondences, and that this number remains the same, whatever be the nature of intervals between the correspondences. And so he definitely talks a lot further into the reading just about change and about how it is, he says, he gives a like personal time with the whole duration concepts. On 10, he says, it coincides with my impatience, that is to say, with a certain portion of my own duration, which I cannot protract or contract as I like. It is no longer something thought, it is something lived. And then he even just kind of referentially is saying, the universe endures, duration is something that is living. The present contains nothing more than the past, and what is found in the effect was already in the cause. And so he definitely is kind of driving that point home, is that it's, I guess, similar to how Ponti said that we don't experience like constituted time. We can't live or have the same experience because as soon as we live something, we're fundamentally changed consciously, and we can't ever perceive it the same way. That he makes kind of the same opening argument that Ponti did in Invisible and Visible, and that you have to, at least whenever you're objectively approaching something, you can't really attribute this lived time or this lived duration, and that it's something that exists just for the purposes of scientific pursuit, but it's not something that can apply at large to how we perceive or view the universe.
Yeah, I got a lot of the sedimentation idea from Merleau-Ponty by reading this. Like, it reminded me a lot about how that kind of, the process was mainly forward going, and you can't live the same experience twice because it kind of sediments on top of each other.
One difference, though, is that, you know, that in that passage about, you just mentioned about the dissolving, whatever it was, salt or sugar, I guess. You know, when he first says that, what I thought he was saying is that the difference is that consciousness is involved, and so that what duration is, duration always involves consciousness, and so it is the fact that there is a consciousness observing this process that brings duration into it. But then later in the same example, and then on through the section, as Chase pointed out, he broadens duration to where it's not merely about consciousness, but it's about the cosmos as a whole, and specifically about life. Although, to be honest, I'm a little confused, because when he's talking about unorganized bodies, you know, so when he's talking about the world beyond consciousness, I guess, unorganized bodies don't have duration, but the universe as a whole does have duration. And so that sort of confuses me.
So I think what he's eventually going to say is that there isn't necessarily a strict separation, say a strict metaphysical or ontological separation between what we'd consider inanimate matter and animate living organisms, but there's a kind of difference in degree, because he does say that that inanimate matter is also a kind of duration, that it also has a duration, and we just kind of pick it out as a isolated system in a relative sense, but ultimately it also is a part of the larger whole. It has these threads of relations that connect it with a larger sense of duration. So both of those are going to have ultimately a duration, because that to him is pretty much the fundamental ontological force, is this idea of duration. So but he does this constantly, where he makes these distinctions, but then they're just kind of relative distinctions to make a point and to make a contrast to illustrate something, yet ultimately he's going to show that they're part of an actual unitary structure of some kind that are just different in qualitative degrees and whatnot. So I think that's why he's showing this distinction between inanimate matter and living organisms, because there is a kind of real distinction there for him, but not some kind of ultimate distinction.
I was a little confused about his notions of animate and inanimate, and whether or not they are applied the same kind of duration. But he does mention that that like the beat of the drums are illuminated by their points in a moving zone or something. And I was kind of, he mentioned the hourglass too, which makes it seem like he does think that inanimate objects can have duration, but it has to do with whether or not we can discern these kinds of moving parts or something like that. But I'm still a little confused about whether or not he would agree or not.
One of the characteristics that differentiates the two types of processes, although, as Chase says, we should be probably careful about making sharp distinctions, but is that he seems to think that the, I don't know what to call them, the processes that don't, maybe what seem to be inanimate processes are reversible, whereas organic processes, including those of consciousness, are not reversible. So, if I think about, like imagine hitting like breaking the, I forgot what you call the group of billiard balls before you break them. But anyway, the stack there, and then you break that and they start rolling everywhere. You could, if you had a camera and you recorded all that, you could sort of back that all up and get back to where you started. Whereas he seems to think that processes with duration, that's not really possible, because there's something that in every moment is added that's brand new, that is compounded into the process of duration, that makes it fundamentally irreversible in that sort of mechanical way. Frankly, I have trouble understand. I understand the basic difference between like something like billiard balls and my conscious states, or even, me looking at it the way the trees grow, and that there's something obviously different between living and conscious processes and just pure mechanical processes. But I'm still having trouble being convinced that you couldn't, it's basically a question of reductionism. Can you reduce those living processes to mechanical processes? And, is the only real difference that the mechanical process, or that the living processes are just a whole lot more complicated, and that if you could break them down into sufficient particles, let's say, that you could reverse them in just the same way that you reverse obviously mechanical processes. He addresses that concern explicitly one or two places, but I have a hard time being convinced by his argument. But at the same time, it's kind of fuzzy in my mind.
I wanted to just bring up, I think it's on page 16, which I think is connected to what all of you said, but please run with it. It's in the middle paragraph, or at least it's the middle of the page 16 in my copy, that starts with "the universe endures." And he says, the more we study the nature of time, the more we shall comprehend that duration means invention, the creation of forms, the continual elaboration of the absolutely new. And there is, and then right above that, he talks about our sun, which radiates heat. And he says at the bottom of that paragraph, the thread attaching it to the rest of the universe is doubtless very tenuous. Nevertheless, it is along this thread that is transmitted down to the smallest particle of the world in which we live. So to me, that was the way I was understanding how he could see both inanimate and animate objects having an endurance, and having, for lack of a better term, processes that are occurring over time. Just wanted to throw that out there.
I think part of the difficulty is going to be, I think I'm using a different copy than everyone, so I'll try to just read the quote instead of, we can like search page numbers together or something. But right after he starts talking about, there's like a paragraph break. He's talking about a living being, what conditions under which like a living being is distinguished from the objects of our perception in sciences. And he notes that whereas we have like a direct access to our own totality, and we can understand ourselves as a whole that might, kind of flow within this process of duration that he's, laying out. We don't have any access to a totality in terms of like a universe. We only have like a chain, like a causal chain of like material relations. And then our science constructs these systems and kind of abstractly applies them to, this, like, if we just took the, like, this regulative idea of like, if we just took the chain to its final conclusion, we would have this totality called the universe. And it seems like it's going to be difficult. I'm still wondering how he's going to prove the existence of this totality in a way that, like, satisfies like a kind of like univocal metaphysics that would see this type of duration be both applied to life and non-life. Because it seems like so far he's done it by like analogy. It's like we have our own understanding of ourselves as a system, as a totality, and we can maybe in some way act as if the universe, the material universe, functions this way. But I'm interested to see how he's going to like ground that, or like, construct an epistemology that would allow like, it seems like he's doing this like with like an epistemological significance of like feeling or intuition or something. So yeah, I think that's like a complicated question as so far as like how widely we can apply duration justifiably.
So I think to kind of somewhat address, I guess, kind of the last few people's concerns and whatnot. So he has, so basically it's like this distinction between life as living organisms and animate matter. And also he has the idea of different kind of causal process is very important, because he makes this distinction that, so I think it's important to note that he doesn't necessarily believe that abstract time or the systems of science are wrong or necessarily false, but he just says that they're kind of partial, or they're kind of pragmatically constructed, but they do have some kind of reality to it. They're just not a totalizing reality, but that they isolate these systems and they deal with these, like billiard ball kind of things where you can predict these things. They seek regularities that are the same over and over. So he says basically that this is not an actual totalizing thing, that if we were really aware of kind of the full detail of this, that we would see that there are these links with a greater whole outside of that isolated system, that there's always still something that can come in there. So the isolation of this system and all the qualities that are given to it that distinguish it from living systems that have duration are a kind of abstract kind of superimposition on this that nevertheless tell you something partially true about it, but not completely. So I think one way to see it is, well, I think there's a number of things I could say about it, but I'll just leave it at that.
Sean has his hand up, which I noticed, by the way, just, these signaling mechanisms, I see the hand up on a screen, so maybe you don't have to put the participant window up unless you want to raise your hand. But Sean, are you still there?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I believe that as long as you have the screen view up where you can see everybody's various screens, then you'll be able to see the hand there. And then I think you as the host can also like put people's hands down and stuff like that. So sorry, I maybe I need to do a little backtracking to get my brain to what I was thinking about. One of the things that I found very interesting, and I think Chase was sort of talking about this right before I got called upon. Um, uh, it seems to me what Bergson is talking about in terms of how the temporality that is relevant to a complex conscious entity like you or I or like a tree um, is distinct from these sort of like mechanistic sort of scientific models that we were looking at is specifically emphasizing this interconnectivity. So this entire like time I was just thinking a lot about like chaos, like while I was reading it, in terms of it seems as though if you simplify a system down, like if you cut it down to very simple components, then it will behave in very regular manners that you can kind of make move in one direction or make move backwards, right, in terms of the temporality, and it works really well with this reductionistic scientific model. And the point that he's making about the kind of intervention of like this interconnectedness with a wider whole is the fact that every time that you try and perform any kind of experiment, there ends up being noise, right? So when we're talking about that in terms of like a specific set of measurements, for instance, that you take during an experiment, scientists don't usually expect the experiment to give them exactly the numbers that they predicted with their scientific models. And the reason why they seem to think that is because, oh, well, anytime that we try and create a, quote, isolated system, unquote, in order to do an experiment, right, we bring something into the lab and we try and do something with it. There's all sorts of little factors that are difficult to control, like heat leaking into the system or a specific kind of chemical being present, right? You know, whatever particular type of experimentation we're doing, there's noise. And one of the big sort of points in chaos is this conception that what we're describing as noise is actually an intrinsic part of chaotic systems. So if we try and be reductionistic about something and we try to boil it down to its essential characteristics, then yeah, we encounter these things that we don't think are very important to the particular measurement that we're trying to take or the specific thing that we're trying to do. But instead, we end up with this sort of like this just off, that's just slightly differentiated from our expectations model, and so we disregard this thing as noise, quote unquote. It's not important to what we're discussing, to what we're trying to investigate. But in a properly chaotic system, any minor variation will result in a radically different outcome. So if that's true, then, and on top of that, it's really impossible to truly isolate any system from noise, then what we've been describing as noise is actually just part of a system of alteration, of difference, of particularity, that make this over here this specific thing and that over there that specific thing. And so it doesn't seem to me that Bergson needs to prove, in terms of like some of the things that were being mentioned earlier, that he needs to prove somehow that like there is this depth of particularity to every single specific experiment. All he has to say is, well, actually, when you look at a specific experiment and its specificity in the way that it's bound up with the location where the scientist did the specific experiment and the fact that the case that it happened in has a little crack at one point, which meant that a little bit of air could siphon in. And that air had this particular set of molecules in it because it happened in this location instead of that location, that you end up with these little variances that make each particular supposedly reducible experiment unique because they're all happening in this greater constituency. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I you know, I agree. So it seems like there's at least two primary differences between, let's say, an abstract, you know, an abstract unliving system and a living or conscious system. And one is the one that Sean's really pointing to, this notion of interconnectivity. And maybe we should say exhaustive interconnectivity, you know, so that ultimately there is no thing or event that's not connected to every other thing and event in the universe, at least to some degree. But then the other, so that seems to be one. Then the other one, another one, maybe there's more, seems to be this notion of life and consciousness producing completely new events. And so on page 27 at the bottom, the last paragraph, he says, now the more we fix our attention on this continuity of life, the more we see organic evolution resembles the evolution of a consciousness in which the past presses against the present and causes the upspringing of a new form of consciousness incommensurable with its antecedents. That the appearance of a vegetable or animal species is due to specific causes, nobody will gainsay. But this can only mean that if, after the fact, we could know all these causes in detail, we could explain by them the form that had been produced. Foreseeing the form, however, is out of the question. And so he seems to be saying that, you know, retrospectively, I mean, this has, not surprisingly, echoes of Whitehead, but retrospectively, I can look back and I can see, and I could, if I was, you know, if I could compile exhaustive data, I could actually find all the causes that brought this into existence. But from this present point, I could never, from the causes that are here, predict what's going to happen next. And I'm not sure, I mean, maybe I'm missing something, but I want to say, why not? I mean, is it just an epistemological problem that I can't possibly know? Or, you know, like if it, maybe this could be reduced to Sean's point, is he just saying that because every new event is actually the compounding of every possible cause in the entire universe, that we can't make that prediction? Or is he saying that, no, there is something that is somehow radically new in every moment that is not simply the result of the compounded total causality of the whole universe? I don't know. I mean, if he really does think it's something absolutely brand new, I'm not sure why I should believe that. So Alex and Sean both have their hands raised.
One thing I just kind of wanted to draw a similarity to is that if you think of like modern physics and like the CERN experiments, you can try to predict based off of just like some background data or noise, given other experiments, to try to postulate that, you know, certain particles are there, but we haven't quite yet designed experimentation that elucidates like certain interactions that are happening that we know that are happening, but we don't have some model that really articulates what exactly is going on. And so we literally slam particles into each other to try to, you know, show that this even smaller, you know, muon exists, or that the Higgs boson is real, or, you know, I think physics is trying to at least bridge that gap between, it goes back to general relativity and quantum mechanics, and trying to figure out, okay, what is one model that applies facsimile across, you know, science? How does that work? I think my biggest question that revolves around that is, if you have something that's like novel to your gaze, how does that come into being to where, you know, someone has that inspiration to try something new? Or, you know, where do you really start without, you know, calling it magic, because you can't physically, fundamentally, philosophically conceive of how some mechanism works, because we don't have a model, or we don't have enough observable data that can either support one, you know, hypothesis or another.
Brad?
If Brad doesn't want to go, I can.
Go ahead.
Okay. So one thing to kind of go back to what Sean was talking about with complexity theory and whatnot. So I read part of this book, Bergson, Complexity and Creative Emergence, and he makes the case, and here the author, that Bergson was a very important part of kind of like the first initial theorization of complexity theory, and he kind of foresaw it to a certain degree, but also kind of put down the initial threads that kind of blossomed into that. And so one example I think is, so I really don't know that much about, chaos theory or whatnot, so just a disclaimer. But one thing I've seen as an example of a chaotic complex system is the weather, mainly because it's an open system. There's constantly new things coming in that you can't quantify. And so quantification requires the idea of kind of this homogeneous kind of chunk of something that you can measure in terms of a unit that makes no distinction between, 1 inch and 2 inches. Those inches aren't dissimilar. They're basically the same. So you kind of have to put those things in that model of quantification, which is necessarily a spatial thing. And basically you can't do that with all these different elements that actually have an effect on the total system, the whole thing. And that's why they talk about weather as ultimately irreducibly complex, that even if they're given the total amount of data, these quantifications of these interchangeable units of measurement of whatever kind, that still you would not be able to predict with a complete exactitude of calculation or prediction what was going to happen. And that's why, weather reports are wrong all the time. Generally, yeah, they can be pretty correct for the most part, but they're not absolute. And that's kind of the point he's making, is that, ultimately all these things are open systems, kind of like the weather, that they're irreducibly complex because the way that we think of things in terms of, this very linear idea of cause and effect, that itself is a kind of abstraction that isolates things in terms of how the intellect works, that draws boundaries between things and isolates these things as solid, billiard balls that hit each other. And it's necessarily spatial, but he's talking about time as something fundamentally different here. Well, not fundamentally different actually, but that's kind of another issue. But I think that's a good connection. It shows how, this book was written in 1907, but I think it's still relevant today, because you can see a lot of the developments in science are kind of talking about this same thing. Alex was just talking about quantum mechanics, and where, the incompleteness theorem, where you have this problem also of where there is no kind of linear causation that is mechanical in its exactness. Instead, you can only talk about probabilistic tendencies of these things. And I think Bergson, he foresaw this kind of tendency of thought also. So I just want to throw it out there.
Following on Chase's point about the open systems, and you seem to me to be bringing up physics, Heisenberg's principle of uncertainty. It does seem like physicists from the 1930s on accept a kind of statistical certainty rather than an absolute certainty. So they're more confident in saying a certain number of atoms will break apart in a nuclear chain reaction, but we're not going to tell you which ones are going to go forth and in what order. But the number, right, and they can graph it, right, with half of a bell curve, the sine curve. So, but let me turn it kind of fold it onto itself. if physicists feel comfortable in being able to talk about statistical certainty and trends, wouldn't that be the doorway for us, in terms of animate objects or in terms of weather systems, no matter how open they are?
But as I just made this comment, neither I don't understand chaos theory either. I'm pretty confident in saying that chaos theory does not require there be an animate principle, a living principle, and neither does quantum mechanics or the uncertainty principle. And so saying that there's indeterminacy or that complex systems cannot be calculated in the way that billiard ball systems can is not the same thing as saying life and consciousness are have a fundamentally different character from the mechanical world. They're just really complicated mechanical processes. So, in fact, my understanding is this contemporary physicists, one of the reasons not one of the reasons, but that they believe that they can explain some of these apparently non-mechanical processes purely mechanically by using some of these explanations. So Brad wanted to talk.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, it seems like there's a danger in trying to compare physical systems with the type of organic totalities that he's talking about, just because it seems like, and I feel like he's going to have to go more deeply into this, but it seems like he wants to say that the most adequate evidence is the evidence of our own life. It's like a proto-phenomenological descriptive theory of, or epistemology. So if you wanted to say, okay, well, there's this I see the problem opposite actually for him. It's he wants to say that we get this kind of certain degree of certainty. He's constantly appealing to even the most common sense knows that life is this totality, life exists as this flow of endurance. Well, then it's the genetic account of material systems is something that has to be explained. So I think there's a problem with at what grounds the seemingly two different types of tendencies that he's talking about here. There's this inorganic tendency that functions along causal chains. It has it's open to conceptual analysis, abstraction, and then there's this living tendency. But yeah, it's kind of I don't know. That's why I'm curious mostly about his epistemology, because it's one thing to say, for instance, speaking of material system, that every time we do this, something gets left out, or that every time we perform this experiment, each time there's been something that's not been included, this noise. But then it's another thing to make a metaphysical affirmation or an ontological affirmation of this is an essential characteristic of systems in a real sense, not just the way that we approach systems or a sort of function of our knowledge or something. So yeah, I think it's there's part of the task ahead is to figure out exactly how the way that he talks about systems and totalities is strange to me.
Sean?
So a couple of things. So one of the things that I wanted to point out when it comes to talking about chaos and the discussions that we've sort of been having, a big point that comes up. So if we examine this specific example of the weather, which comes up a lot, one of the reasons why it comes up a lot in discussions of chaos is just because it was one of the first areas of scientific inquiry where this became really clear. We had clear, concrete examples of what the mathematics implied was possible from the beginning. And one of the first sort of like oh, here's Babu's first sort of example of a sort of scientific thing that you can do that it implies chaos is this initial weather modeling that they were doing to try and predict the progression of storms. They'll sort of replay these models over and over and over again in order to try and get a sense of what's going on. And and they put them into these huge supercomputers that like plow through all of the numbers of the various sort of equations of all the different things that are flowing into it. And the person who was running this particular experiment in this particular supercomputer decided, okay, I just want to look at this very specific portion of the event that I just saw over again. So they just sort of went in and they clipped the specific period of time that they wanted to start at. So rather than starting at the beginning of the simulation, they started partway in, and then just plugged in those numbers and wanted to start the project from there, right? So start the what's the word I'm looking for here? The simulation. And because they plucked that specific number from that specific location, instead of starting over from the beginning, they had a completely different result. So basically, the storm did something completely different from what it did in the initial version of the simulation that they were looking at. And if you sort of try and dig into why that happened, it's basically because, okay, well, you needed to make this sort of discrete assumptions about what the system looked at that particular moment, which meant that there were some rounding errors, which meant that basically the very, very tiny differences in assumptions about the locations of various sort of winds and pressures and what directions the flows were going, like dynamically resulted in like completely alternative sort of possibilities. And I think that this ties into Berson's conception of like duration, insofar as like if you are trying to snip things up into concrete and discrete sort of possibilities, then you end up with completely like you end up in these complex systems and making assumptions that actually make it impossible for you to make predictions. And a big thing about systems and chaos theory is that if you could, and this I because one thing is, y'all are, and part of the problem here is I'm running off of the Project Gutenberg version because my like physical copy hasn't arrived yet, so I don't know if I've read all of the pages that that you guys have read. I read up to the number of pages that we were supposed to be at on creative evolution, but I'm having trouble like finding things as y'all are plucking things out and stuff like that. But I didn't really get the sense that Bergson anywhere made the claim that organic systems wouldn't be predictable if we had exhaustive knowledge of them. He brings that up as like a ridiculous example of the way that like sort of reductionists talk about things, but it is just like kind of an epistemological fact that we don't know all of the factors that flow into any kind of process. So even if Bergson isn't making that claim, I mean, part of what might be going on here is just that the people who went on to talk about things like chaos theory were more sort of like more traditional in their thinking, or maybe more conservative in the way that they described it in traditional science. Whereas Bergson is maybe suggesting something that's a little bit more radical, but maybe a little bit more difficult to prove. And if so, then if he has the ability to prove this, then that's very interesting to me. But it doesn't seem to me that we need to make any of these sort of assertions. We don't need to say, for instance, that like, oh well, if we had like godlike, epistemological knowledge of everything, all of the various factors, all of the various equations, all of the various initial positions, that we couldn't predict things. Part of what chaos theory says is that like basically having that is equivalent to just having a physical example of whatever the object is that you're looking at, right? Like if you had that kind of exhaustive knowledge about something, it would have to look identical to the thing that you're trying to examine. Because anything else, any kind of simulation wouldn't do it justice. It would attempt to like limitedly quantify something, pack it up into a little sort of discrete quantumatized bits that you're going to plug into a computer, which you need to do if you're going to plug something into a computer. You have to carve it up into little bits in order to be able to simulate it, right? And if it's sort of like, okay, well, once you factor in all of these, considerations, that like, if I wanted to simulate a river and I wanted to do that with perfect accuracy, then I would have to create an exact duplicate of the river. And then part of the problem with creating that exact duplicate of the river is the fact that this river is in this particular location, right, within a relationship with, the weather and with the surrounding geography and with the people that live on the banks and all of those sorts of things. Is like, well, if you wanted to simulate the river, you would have to make it identical to that river, which would mean that it would need to exist in like an identical universe with all of the same identical factors. And as you push away in the distance from that river, and you're starting to consider like, well, what are the effects of Alpha Centauri on like the weather patterns, on like the effects become incredibly minute and small, but they're still present. In some ways, like some of the things that y'all are mentioning, I think that if Bergson is making these claims, then I think it will be kind of rough for him to justify them. I don't think he needs to, in terms of like thinking about the history of this kind of project. And I didn't really interpret him as being that committed to them based on the bit that I read.
Yeah, like from my interpretation, I agree with you, Sean. I think that I saw it more of as similar maybe to Ponty's The Visible and the Invisible, and that he's kind of pointing at problems in science and problems in the way that we're perceiving life and consciousness and all these things. And I think he's just pointing out that in the same sense that like there are holes in our understanding of consciousness, and we have these vague, like artistic and poetic understandings of consciousness. What if we applied those to life? What if for a second we just imagined that life and science and these things we're talking about are the same? And then I think through the process of that, these similarities that he ends up finding and these connections that he ends up creating prove that there's something beyond our current understanding, and I think he's going to come back to these points later when he makes a more rigorous understanding of his system, or whatever you want to call it. But I do think that this is less about pointing out all these specific things and saying that life is consciousness and that they're the same thing. I think it's more about saying, all right, there are some similarities here. There's things that we don't understand about it. So if we look at it as if it's consciousness, then maybe we can find something new from it.
So I want to, so Sean, maybe I'm misunderstanding, but so regarding the point that if we have knowledge of all the details in this totalizing way of everything at a present moment, that we would be able to foresee what would happen in the future. I think Bergson, so at least on my version, it's on page 6 in the middle, he says that even if a superhuman intelligence would not have been able to foresee the simple, indivisible form which gives to these purely abstract elements their concrete organization. Not sure that made sense. So basically, he addresses this idea of like a superhuman intelligence knowing all these details, and says that still you wouldn't be able to foresee all these things, because that idea is basically that there's just a rearrangement of things already perceived, that there's not actually a real creation of anything new, which his point is that duration is this coming into existence of something that is absolutely new. And that's kind of this synthesis of the past coming back into the present and kind of propelling it in this continuous unfolding that's constantly in motion, but that to kind of put these things into elements that are already perceived, as he says, and that just have new groupings that if you understood, the tendency or the state of the grouping at the present moment, that you'd be able to predict what the future would be necessarily. He says that that doesn't basically consider the aspect of duration to bring something totally new into existence. It's not just the rearrangements of parts that are currently there. So hopefully that makes some clarity. I don't want to, keep going to this whole freedom thing, but I think also this this idea of of novelty, of the new, that's a huge part of his fundamental ontology, which, so to kind of go back to what Brad was talking about or asking earlier about, what is his overall, ontology here that really connects all this stuff. Personally, I think it kind of takes Deleuze to somewhat better articulate what Bergson starts by trying to talk about, how exactly is true novelty and difference and process actually possible. So, but I think Bergson, that's ultimately what he's trying to get at. And I think what he's trying to do is show that there's always some kind of a unique way that the past goes into the present, and that it differentiates itself by doing this in a way that you cannot just predict in an absolute manner necessarily. So yeah.
Reeser, you pointed out that he makes little arguments here and there about the consideration of well, what if it is just due to our ignorance? It's just provisional, the mechanistic worldview wants to say that we just gather enough, our technology will get better. If we find ways to expand our ability to isolate the system, we can, kind of isolate the totality. At least on page 20, I feel like he makes one of those comments about it will be said that this impotence is due only to our ignorance. This is in the individuality and age section, and the paragraph starts with the present state of an unorganized body depends exclusively on what happened at the previous instant. If anyone else is trying to find it in a different version. But yeah, in page 20 of this edition, he refers to that idea that we could just be ignorant. We may as well. We might be able to achieve this one day. But the phrasing he uses afterwards as his argument back is that it may equally well express the fact that the present moment of a living body does not find its explanation and in the moment immediately before. I feel like the key phrasing there is equally well, and so he's not exactly making an argument that he's presenting a more likely theory or he's presenting a theory that's more certain, but just that we have no reason not to consider the fact that maybe things are different than the scientific approach will allow us to. And then I haven't read into this, but following that paragraph into the next paragraph, which begins with any attempt to distinguish between an artificial and a natural system. I can just read that. Those first two sentences stuck out to me. It looks like maybe that's where he goes into, what reason do we have to distinguish between living and non-living? That's when he asks, we find it equally difficult to imagine that the organized has duration and that the unorganized is not. I haven't read into that. I haven't reread that paragraph, but looks like maybe there's some elucidation as to some of his lines of arguments. But I guess just to go back to the phrasing of equally well, and that he's not making a more likely or definitive argument for this perspective, but there's no reason for us not to at least consider it and see what comes of it. This also reminds me of an argument that was made in a secondary text on Merleau-Ponty, actually. And the guy says that Merleau-Ponty isn't presenting a system that's that proves the normal system wrong. I forget the details, but he's not presenting a system that proves everything wrong, but he's just giving one that's just as likely, that we might as well consider and see what can come of it. And that's at least the approach I see Bergson doing, that he's not proving the scientific reductionism wrong, but just offering an alternative. I feel like this also is supported by the fact when he starts talking about transformism, which I don't know the details of transformism versus maybe any other view of evolution that he's opposing it to, but I feel like he talks about it very modestly, and he's just like, there's some support for this, blah, 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 blah. It's continually growing, right? But he even points out that it's like, it may not be demonstrable, it may not be provable. I guess where does that leave us if he can't prove his system, or if these other perspectives can't prove themselves? Do we just dismiss them? Because I guess that's the scientific way of dismissing them.
Could someone actually explain what transformism is? I don't remember him ever like explicitly saying, and he just kind of starts talking about it at some point. But.
I didn't really know. I looked it up on a couple of places, and apparently transformism was a general term that was used when people first started talking about evolution. And transformism, that I gather just in really general sense, is just the idea that species can transform one into another. So, prior to I don't know what period of time, people assumed species were fixed. And, and because that's how we tell what something is it has these specific differences with other species. And I don't know what time period this was. It was before Darwin. By some time period, people started wondering whether maybe species could shift from one into another through some sort of transformational processes. And from what I gathered, it's actually more associated with Lamarck than it is with Darwin. But at least in this short passage, Bergson seems to use it not in the specifically Darwinian or Lamarckian sense, but just the general notion that species are not fixed and can move from one to another. And there was some comment in there, that, like when Joey was saying, when he was saying, well, like this is on page 25, maybe a fourth of the way down. Like Joey said, he said at the beginning of that paragraph, well, let's admit maybe transformism is wrong. And then on page 25, he says, therefore, biology could and would continue to establish between living forms the same relations and the same kinship as transformism supposes today. So, he seems to be saying, well, even if transformism is wrong, my mode of analysis is still legitimate. And so he seems to be just using it in this really general sense of species can shift and change, rather than, I don't see him as being committed to Lamarck, for example, here.
Yeah, maybe I'm just unfortunate to have my brain rotted by the sort of debates about creationism on early YouTube. But it was really striking to me that this was sort of a debate between what nowadays would probably be called sort of like microevolution, which is an idea that some sort of creationist types tried to push. That basically there was a point of creation that at which point different animal forms existed, but that beyond that point, diversification continue to happen. And so the way that a lot of these creationists would talk about it was that things can sort of evolve within their kind. That's the phraseology that they use, but they can't like fundamentally transform into a different kind of thing. And since they think that there were discrete different creation points, then basically there should be a point beyond which you can't resolve any of the various sort of animal kinds or plant kinds or whatever we're talking about back into one singular sort of pre-existing ancestor. And so one thing is, I would assume he's being quite conservative in the way that he's talking about this, because he's talking at a time when the science is much less set. But the other thing that he seems to be saying that I find kind of interesting is he's sort of being like, well, even if those theories turn out to be true, it still seems as though something about, right, the way that he's talking about it as sort of like the almost sort of like the internal sort of creative mind that was responsible for the process of the creation of all of these different things, all were like, must have had in mind the fact that these like basically some sort of basic body plan that then got extended out into all of these various different forms. Like maybe that would be an alternative explanation of why, for instance, Evo Devo seems to work, that we can look at fish embryos, and right, he explicitly references this example, fish embryos and bird embryos and mammal embryos, and the fact that they all look similar at earlier states in their existence. Right. In terms of like the species being sort of static. I mean, what's interesting is that like theoretically these evolutionary theories go back a very long ways. Like I believe there was a pre-Socratic, I don't remember his name right now, who suggested something like that basically there was like basically all creatures started off as of like a random combination of limbs.
Empedocles.
Empedocles, right? And the natural selection kind of like determined that like it only the forms that actually worked were the ones that survived, and all the other ones sort of died off. It seems like something like Darwinian theories or Lamarckian theories or some version of an evolutionary conception seem to go back really far. Like I've heard people claim that there are, I've never read them, so I don't, but that in the Bhagavad Gita there are like examples of like basically counter arguments against this view, right? Which that's a really old book. So if they were right feeling the need to make counter arguments against these like kind of static visions of biology, or make, you know, in favor of these static visions of biology, then it implies that people were maybe suspicious that something like evolution had been happening for a really long time, long before any of these kind of modern theorists got off the ground.
Yeah, what came to mind, I guess, like, you know, moving into discussion of this sort of like biological idiom that he keeps bringing back up. When he introduces this notion of transformism and then sort of makes the point that Nevitt recounted about, you know, whether or not this specific theory is true in all of its particulars, the philosophical kind of taking up of transformism holds. I mean, it's interesting, at least in my translation, at the beginning of that paragraph, he talks about how the language of transformism forces itself now upon all philosophy, as the dogmatic affirmation of transformism forces itself upon science. And I think, I mean, part of the difficulty in like kind of sussing out his method and kind of, you know, determining the validity of the claims that he makes is it, you know, later he talks about this like violence to thought that needs to take place in order to kind of get a grip on the kind of totality he's talking about. So whereas in like scientific systems, it's an amalgamation. It's not a one, it's not a unity. Like the reason that like, so thinking about like indeterminacy in scientific systems is like, you know, we just don't have all the parts yet. If we had all the parts, then we could kind of just outline in advance all of the possibilities. But when he talks about individuality, he talks about like unity and simplicity. It's almost like Neoplatonic or something, but couched in this like biological terminology. So like I mean, there's a notion of evolution and like intuition and feeling, and it seems to me like what he wants to do is kind of undermine speculative philosophy's dependence on the language of conceptual analysis, like the language of like abstraction and certainty, like the deduction to principles and categories and the creation of concepts, and then introduce a new image of thought, to borrow like a Deleuzian term, that can account for or perceive or have some sort of like verifying experience of the type of simplicity that is definitive of life in some way that we get access to through the experience of our bodies and our consciousness. So it's interesting how, I mean, like the way that analogy functions is different here, like the way that argumentation functions. So, I mean, to go back to Joey's point about like, you know, why should we take this particular theory over others? I do feel like he's going to want to convince us that there's something about his theory that like is, you know, worthwhile. But at the same time, it seems like, you know, that's something to come. I don't necessarily think that I at least got out at the beginning part, like the epistemological like construction, like the construction of an epistemological system that would justify a lot of the claims that he's kind of just making at this beginning of this first chapter.
Austin? Austin, you wanted to say something?
I had a point earlier, but then you said something, Dr. Reeser, and that kind of erased that point. So I was like, no, I don't know.
I'm so sorry.
It's okay. I'm just taking it all in. I haven't studied philosophy in a while, and I'd kind of given myself over to biology for some time. And now I'm trying to undo some of those, thoughts in my mind. So I'm just trying to open it up. But at the moment, I just feel kind of mind blown. So I'm just taking it all in. Good stuff, guys. Appreciate it.
So one thing I can say in response to what Brad was just saying about there's one thing we didn't really talk about is, so he talks in the introduction, this really interesting idea that, which I think is really important for him, is, this idea of the intellect and what the role of the intellect is, and that he's kind of doing a pretty revolutionary change in terms of his methodology of philosophy, and that he's critiquing this totalization of the intellect, which he says is modeled on this tendency of life to create these isolatable systems of what we would call inanimate matter. And I think, so he doesn't talk about it necessarily, at least in the section that we've discussed or read, but so his methodology is, based off this idea of intuition, which is definitely a kind of, at least I see it as a sort of kind of like a proto-phenomenology, but I think he does get a lot of this actually from Neoplatonism. And so Plotinus, he had this idea of like an intellectual intuition, like the exact thing that Kant denied, and said, to know the noumenal, you would have to have a kind of intellectual intuition of these things that, goes beyond a kind of relative empirical observation of these things, which is kind of perspectival or situated in something. So he talks about intuition, as a kind of intellectual sympathy. And so I'm not going to go into that because we haven't really gotten to that in the text, but I think his important point is that he says in the introduction that we shouldn't necessarily throw out the intellect. It's not something simple like that, but he says we need to combine basically the intellect with these other modes of intelligence. I can't remember the exact phrase he uses, in order to understand life and motion, because the intellect is based off of this tendency to see things as abstract and spatial and distinct, and it has a hard time understanding life in the sense of life as necessarily movement and duration. So instead, we need to actually combine these different forms of intelligence in order to understand life, to understand movement, to understand duration. So I think that's a very crucial aspect of how he's kind of trying to set the scene here, just in these first few pages that we've read.
I wanted to read something. This is sort of in support of Joey and Chase when they're talking about life being not merely a form of matter. So, like just going back to this thing we're batting around, is Bergson saying that really the only difference between life and matter is that life is just really, really, really complicated. And that, that when we talk about matter, all we're doing is abstractly breaking it down into cognizable units that we can mathematize. but that's not really what reality's like. So is he saying that, or is he saying, no, life is something, I don't know, different, or, you know, fundamentally different in some way? So on page 27, about halfway down, he says, so this is, Brad, this is almost at the end. He says,
sorry, what's the section header? Is there like a...
Transformism. It's right before biology, physics, and chemistry. So I think toward the end of Transformism, he says, regarded from this point of view, life is like a current passing from germ to germ through the medium of a developed organism. It is as if the organism itself were only an excrescence, a bud caused to sprout by the former germ endeavoring to continue itself in a new germ. The essential thing is the continuous progress. So this teleological language here, the continuous progress indefinitely pursued, an invisible progress on which each visible organism rides during the short interval of time given to it to live. So again, it seems to me he's not merely saying, I mean, I think he does seem to be saying that the whole cosmos is a giant system, and anytime you carve it up into pieces, it's an approximation, you're gonna miss stuff. And maybe it is a precursor to chaos theory, in that maybe there are aspects of systems that are so complicated that you can't really analyze them in that algorithmic way at all. But it seems like he's saying more than that, that life is something that, what's the term that rides during the short interval of time, right? You know, sort of rides on this thing. And that, you know, as Chase was saying, he seems to want to say that, you know, like that it's not merely, even if, let's say, given chaos theory, it's not merely that you have a really, really complicated mechanical system, but that there is something that is brand new, not merely because we can't conceive of it. So again, it's not merely an epistemological problem, but because it really is brand new. And I mean, like in a fundamentally ontological, something new springing into existence, not merely something we could not ever possibly calculate. So, you know, I could be wrong, but that seems to be. So we got hands up for Sean and Chase.
You want to go first, Chase?
Sorry, my hand was just up from earlier. I didn't actually have anything new to say.
Okay. So a few things. So one thing is, because this is a bad tendency that I had when I first learned about chaos theory, and it's been something that I've actively had to work on as I like kind of reapproach it, and that is to like interpret it very conservatively. So one way that you can understand chaos theory is to basically just say, well, what it's telling us is that everything that reductionism tells us about systems is true, except that they aren't predictable in the traditional way that we naturally approach it. And I think that this approach has a few different problems, but the biggest thing is that it just sort of like doesn't allow chaos to speak on its own terms in terms of the ways that we think about it as an explanation of the world, right? We're basically just assuming that chaos theory is something that we're tacking on to a traditional scientific interpretation of what's going on. And so when you describe it as basically saying that, okay, well, it's just saying that, you know, this system of interrelationship between things is just really complicated and it's not really easy to sort of predict what's going on. Well, you know, that is, I think, to do the equivalent of just reading Bergson as saying that, okay, well, everything about what science tells us about how these things operate is true, except that you know, living organisms have some sort of strange natural capacity to, I don't know, behave irregularly, and we just try to interpret that as like a continuous motion machine of like like, I don't know, random spurts of novelty into like almost as right, if we're going to try and reduce it down to quantum mechanics and just say, okay, well, it's just basically random number generators pumping stuff in. Like, I think if we want to take chaos theory seriously, we have to sort of begin conceptualizing from the beginning and go, okay, well, I'm going to throw out this conception that anything can be mechanistic, because why would I ever think anything can be mechanistic and reductionistic in its form, when that's only possible under really narrow prescripts, and even then I have to actively sort of disregard all of the noise that's arriving in the system in order to talk about it concretely. You know, the other thing that I'm am sort of worried about in this is it seems to me we're dragging in a presumption that Bergson thinks that material reality has properties or characteristics that are different from living things, right? And the thing that y'all keep trying to say that I think is problematic is that, well, he has to be saying that because he's saying living systems have this capacity for novelty. Well, even if you think back to the other authors that we've read, right? If you're thinking back to Deleuze or Whitehead, or I would say even Merleau-Ponty, although he's much more focused on the body, so this doesn't come up as much. They want to run with the exact opposite presumption. They want to say, well, maybe the way that biology operates is a better model to begin thinking about the material things that science wants to describe reductionistically. And maybe that stuff behaves in very mechanical ways under very narrow prescriptions, but then, right, you could do the same thing with, with organic chem. You could say, okay, well, biological processes that happen within my cells are, very mechanistic if I examine them in isolation, but yet those things are obviously part of a much more dynamic organic system. And so I think the thing that Nevitt, you said early on in chat, and I missed it because I wasn't paying good attention. My apologies. Was just asking about, well, is the weather a living system, right? And from a perspective of chaos theory, chaos would say yes, right? It's a complicated interrelationship that is, feeding off of a lot of the same inputs of energy that we are, right? I mean, the main things that are sort of driving weather are things like solar radiation, the activities of plants in terms of the ways that they sort of dynamically shape the composition of the atmosphere, the presence or absence of certain rocky outcrops, or really high elevations, or dust particulate in the air. So, if we're running with the assumption that, well, Bergson thinks that, there's dirty concrete matter that behaves in these regulistic ways, and then there's unique, biological matter that, that has some sort of magical capacity, then we're inevitably going to invent a kind of dualism that, again, I just haven't seen present in what I've read so far. I mean, in terms of some of the things that y'all have even pointed to so far, right? I mean, so the thing on page 6 that Chase sort of pointed out earlier, I mean, he's very careful in what he says here, and I thought it was very interesting. The way that he talks about a simple oh god, I lost the page that it was or the specific point that it was on, because this was a while ago and I've been sort of zooming around to continue to engage with people. Now, such is the case, this is on page 6, with each of our states regarding a moment in history that it gradually unfolds. It is simple, and it cannot have been already perceived, since it concentrates in its individuality all that has been perceived, with the present and adding to it besides. It is an original moment, no less original history. I mean, it seems to me that part of what he's saying there, and particularly part of what he's saying about our incapacity to perceive things, has to do with the fact that if we don't know all of the principles and all of the inputs that are part of a particular kind of system, then a simple component, right, an unpredictable component, because it's novel, it's new, it's not part of the current assumptions that I have about how the system operates, will result in unpredictable facts that I can't account for. So I would guess, be careful about the way that we're reading Bergson, or at least I would like to be careful about the way that we're reading him, in that I don't want us to read a fundamental dualism into him if he's not suggesting that.
I like where Sean's coming from. I think in support, again, is that page 21, where he does talk about seemingly blurring the distinction between the organized and unorganized. at that point, he does say that we're under the impression that we can look at an unorganized system and refer to the moment immediately before to understand like what happened to it in the present. But he like kind of dissects that concept of the previous immediate moment into saying that like that is an abstract idea, and that it kind of involves and assumes or presumes like a whole entire history that's kind of like condensed into a present, into like one singular moment that causes that next present moment. He gets into saying that even that instantaneous previous moment is a kind of like condensation of a lot of time, which implies that like even those material systems have a kind of duration that is bringing them about, even though there's a kind of like originality still in the next moment.
I just wanted to clarify, I'm not saying, and I don't know if this was directed at me at all, but I just wanted to point out that like I don't think that he's necessarily like positively ascribing, well, I won't even say what he's doing. I mean, I don't think that it's a question of, is reality fundamentally dualistic or monistic? I see it as like an antinomy. Like until because he explicitly says like we can observe living beings as whole organisms, but we can't. We never have a perception of the totality of a material system. So anything that if we say, oh well, we can apply what we see in life to material reality, or we can't, that seems to me to presuppose that, I mean, we would have to be able to see material reality as a system in order to do that justifiably. Like we would have to be able to be like, we see our life as a system, we see material reality as a system, or sorry, totality, I think, so as a system and totality are different. But unless we have like a direct observation or some mode of epistemological access to material reality as a totality, we're just speculating about its nature, whether we apply a sort of dualism to it or a monism or not. Yeah, I mean, it just seems that like, when we're thinking about, for instance, trying to make the analogy go the other way and thinking about like indeterminacy, like we're still thinking about like amalgamation of parts. Like what is absent is a part that we were not aware of. And you could probably correct me on this if I'm wrong, but like it seems different saying there's something indeterminate due to the sheer complexity of all of the pieces of this puzzle and a direct immediate perception of a unique totality that would have no pieces missing because it's not an amalgamation. It's a single unity with I forget the word he uses, but like profiles, or like each part of it is not like a part in the sense of like a part of a machine. It's a part in the sense of like I don't know, I think of like Spinoza or something, like a mode or an attribute, or I guess mode would be more on the mark, but. Yeah.
So I just posted that excerpt from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Bergson. So he says in the preface of, now this is talking about a different book, Matter and Memory, which is an earlier book, but he refers to it in this book. So presumably he still endorses what he says there, or at least most of it. He says matter and memory is frankly dualistic, since it affirms both the reality of matter and the reality of spirit. However, he's quick to warn us that the aim of the book is to overcome the theoretical difficulties which have always beset dualism. In the history of philosophy, these theoretical difficulties have generally arisen from a view of external perception, which always seems to result in an opposition between representation and matter. Thus, Bergson's theory of pure perception, laid out in the first chapter of Matter and Memory, aims to show that beyond both realism and idealism, our knowledge of things in its pure state takes place within the things it represents. So, and earlier Brad had used the language that Bergson uses in here of tendencies. So there's these tendencies, so which doesn't necessarily imply completely separate principles, but that certain kinds of things, or I don't know what, certain kinds of something have one tendency and another one have another tendency, But what this excerpt here reminds me of, and not surprisingly, I suppose, is phenomenology. A lot of phenomenologists like Bergson, and phenomenology, in my understanding, tries to break down the distinction between mind and world, and tries to overcome that dualism. And it seems like, if this is an interpretation granted by someone who wrote this entry, but if this entry is correct, Bergson says that it is frankly dualistic because you've got matter and spirit, but he wants to say that he's really trying to overcome this sort of dualism. And the way he seems to want to overcome it in this description is in a similar sort of way that phenomenology wants to overcome the distinction between mind and world, by saying that the two in some way are co-constitutive or something. So, again, you could say, some people read phenomenology and they say, oh, this is idealistic. Or, they read, they might even say it's dualistic in some ways. And I think maybe Bergson is doing something similar. He's acknowledging that there are these two different tendencies, as he calls them, but he's trying to overcome this radical separation between the two. And this reminds me of the distinction between vitalism and Hylozoism. And I've thought of Bergson as being a vitalist, which in my understanding, which I may be wrong about this, says that a material principle and a life principle are distinct and that reality is some sort of mixing of the two. Whereas Hylozoism is saying, no, matter is already from the very beginning proto-living, and that at a certain level of complexity, life emerges. And so this discussion is making me wonder, maybe Bergson's more of a Hylozoist than he is a vitalist. Maybe he's saying that there are these principles in the fundamental ontological matter of the universe, and that's where these tendencies are: a tendency toward life and a tendency toward, I don't know what the other one would be, not death, but just pure matter or something like that. And that these two tendencies are both there. Maybe he's saying something like that. I'm not laying down a definitive interpretation.
So,
Yeah.
I wanted
Go
to
ahead,
ask
Joey.
a question just to kind of clarify. Is Brad? So yeah, what we're talking about is kind of besides what Brad seems to be pointing out, and that maybe, are you saying that like there's no reason for us to assume that like matter has this like room left over for a kind of gestaltic originality to come about from the past into the next moment?
You're asking Brad?
Yeah.
I don't think I'm necessarily saying that it does or doesn't. I'm just saying that I've yet to see how Bergson would go about projecting that type of like vital, the sense of simplicity and totality onto what he defines as like matter. And I mean, I'll admit from the, I guess, middle, it's too late to be the start, that I'm coming at it from like with certain like critical presumptions, like in the sense of like Kantian philosophy, that I see him as wanting to go beyond in a certain sense, or at least go beyond that image of thought that would be deductive and like analogous to the mathematical sciences. But I just think, and I think I'm agreeing with people who have already said like it's too early to really say what he is kind of constructing as like an ontology or metaphysics or something, because he hasn't really given us the epistemological tools to be able to like understand how we would make that jump from life to matter.
Yeah, so I definitely think he's more of a Hylozoist than a vitalist, in the sense that I think there's more of a continuum going on here than necessarily these sharp ontological distinctions between matter and life and whatnot. So I think based off that definition, I don't think he's a vitalist, or necessarily a dualist, but I think ontology is his philosophical method is basically to use these distinctions that are, for the most part, dualistic in order to come to these conceptual understandings, but that we have to be careful about these because he's giving these as qualitative differences that are still part of a continuum. So that link I sent for a PDF, it's on this book, Deleuze on Cinema, but the first, I don't know, it's like the first 30 or so pages are just about Bergson, and it gives a really good description of Bergson's kind of total idea, and also how Deleuze kind of sees it as a sort of monistic pluralism based off of, so and he talks about in Matter and Memory, this first chapter is about the image as a kind of immanent principle in a sense, and he kind of takes that to forge something that's between idealism and realism, and he uses this along with, but then puts this image in motion, and really the continuum is in a sense a kind of movement image that's this fluctuations of different contractions and dilations of duration. So that's kind of his overall ontology. At least they explain it pretty well in the book, and I don't want to go too far ahead of what we're simply reading, but just to kind of ground this. So in a way, he's saying that these distinctions of, something like what's seemingly like dead matter and what's seemingly like a living organism, that basically these are distinctions in different contractions and dilations of duration. And that basically the more that and by contractions, this is basically how the past kind of goes into the present, how it flows into it, that there's these qualitative distinctions based off that, and that organisms are generally going to have this greater capacity to be selective of the past and of external forces that they then act out, that they're kind of these centers of indetermination, and that makes them distinct but not necessarily ontologically distinct, in the sense of that would make him a vitalist. So I definitely would, if anybody has time, I would check out that PDF and read that first chapter past the introduction, because I think it gives a really good description. And also it does talk about somewhat about how Deleuze uses Bergson and gives this idea, this theory of cinema. And also I thought what was really interesting is he relates this Spinoza to it, and this idea of expression, which kind of goes into what Brad was talking about, about modes and whatnot. And it clicked for me that he was able to basically use like this immanence of Spinoza along with this idea from like this image movement based off this continuum of duration, and to put those together, it made sense to me. I'm probably not explaining it very well at all, but yeah, I just want to put that out there.
There still seems to me, I'm not up to speed on philosophy of mind or, philosophy of science or biology, but that it seems to me there's still this problem of today even, of how do you get consciousness out of unconscious matter, and how do you get living things out of dead matter? And, so there's this, you've got physics and chemistry and then biology. Well, something weird happens between chemistry and biology. And, and there are reductionists that say, well, you can just explain that purely in terms of physical laws, but living matter organizes itself. It's self-organizing in ways that non-living things aren't. They're just some fundamental puzzles. And the same problem with consciousness. People say, well, you get a certain organization of matter a certain kind of way, and unconsciousness just kind of shows up. But that's not much of an explanation. And so you've even got like it seems to me, very conservative analytical philosophers like what's the guy at UT now? Chase,
Strawson.
Yeah, Strawson, who's now a panpsychist, maybe he always has been, and saying, well, the only way you can, if you want to, he says the reason he is a panpsychist is because he does not want to be a dualist. He says the only way to avoid dualism, mind-matter dualism, is to say that matter is already proto-conscious. Otherwise, you're gonna always end up with some kind of dualism. And Hylozoism, people don't like it today because it sounds too vitalistic to say that matter is somehow proto-living. But you might make a similar kind of argument that how do you explain the distinction between the living and the dead without just saying, well, this is what happens? If you're going to have any explanation and you're going to avoid a dualism, can you avoid something like Hylozoism? At least, if you can avoid vitalism, can you then avoid Hylozoism? So, if Bergson's, if he is a Hylozoist or a dualist, then, maybe it's just, I think of these kinds of things as part of this ongoing effort to try to explain how do you get life and consciousness out of rocks, basically.
I think another thing that emphasizes that point from a different angle that's found in what we've read so far in Bergson is this relation between consciousness and life and time. Because I think you can frame it the same way, like if there was any moment in, life and time and consciousness or duration seem to go together, seem to go hand in hand in some way. And, I think you could make the same point for Bergson is like, if like when not only thinking of it in terms of like when would consciousness have come onto the scene, but like when would time have come onto the scene? Like you can't, if abstract time alone applies to this separate metaphysical entity called matter, then how do you explain progression at all? Like it seems like far from the maybe like positivistic understanding of things that would start with inert matter and think about what point in its development do we get organic life. It almost seems like you can kind of like flip this transcendentally and say like, well, it seems like inert matter in being an abstraction, or like abstract time and being an abstraction presupposes time as duration, like time as this kind of vital living principle that allows for evolutionary progress.
Chase, did you still want
to? No, sorry, I forgot to just put the hand thing down. But so one thing, you're talking about the two tendencies, Nevitt, and so I think what he's talking about there, so this also goes into the question about dualism, is he seems to constantly be repeating this through his different works, and that it's kind of like this one universe that has two competing tendencies that tend to also kind of, they tend to be reciprocal in a lot of ways and work together. So in this one, he talks about individuation and reproduction. But I think that's also with the question about, material or living. So generally we'd see, something that is living, it has to be, in some sense, isolated enough, individuated enough to be a discernible organism, but also it has to be able to reproduce. So that's also something that's kind of, and one thing that's interesting about, this idea of individuation, it only is able to individuate and isolate itself by also opening itself to these different relations, and also kind of ultimately kind of transcending itself through reproduction in a way that actually somewhat carries on some aspect of itself, but also opens up these possibilities for then new forms of life to emerge out of it. So that's, I think, one example of how there's these two tendencies, but they kind of work together. And he kind of repeats this on multiple levels. So in his one of his later books, The Two Sources of Morality and Religion, he talks about closed morality and open morality as just another example of this, where he basically takes the kind of these same tendencies of life and species and whatnot, and he applies that to social systems, that there's these tendencies of social systems to kind of close themselves and exclude others and see their identity within this fixed and static system there that's isolated. And then an open morality is something that, just as the term implies, it opens itself up to include others. And that these are never static states, but they're kind of different movements that are constantly fluctuating. And you never have them in a totality of there's just openness, just closeness. They always kind of work together in these ways, yet they also do have a distinction and a kind of antagonism. So I think that's one way to kind of see also that this is something that's occurring with duration itself to kind of form these materials, these systems that you would see more as material and more inanimate, and then ones that you would see as more distinctly living. So I didn't explain the last part very well, but hopefully that helps somewhat to kind of clarify that.
Yeah, I think when I was, I'm just like kind of rereading a lot of this stuff now, and I'm starting to see that, I think there is a sort of like there's two sets of tendencies, I think, like artificial versus living, and then consciousness to non-conscious, whatever that is. And I see both of those as kind of in a sense being like the two tendencies of themselves as well, that both kind of they describe two separate things, but they kind of build up each other. It's like the more we talk about the difference between artificial and living things, and the more we discuss that, and the more we talk about the difference of consciousness to not consciousness, they both kind of have similarities and build up each other. And I think we start to begin to understand them and see their similarities as we kind of analyze those separately. So in a way, I think that the two sets of tendencies create two tendencies in themselves, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that definitely helps in a sense, because you only have these individuations of organisms if you have a kind of reproduction also. And the way those two go together, yet as he points out, they're at the same time kind of antagonistic. I think that's an important understanding of this tendency in his own thought that he sees as, tendencies in life, but also I think that gives you a pretty good hint of his kind of overall ontology, because he is trying to say that basically, to a certain degree, life is a kind of extrapolation of this ontological tendency of, duration, of novelty that's also a kind of fluctuation. And also, I think you can kind of see it also in a sort of, Nietzschean kind of sense of, the will to power is kind of this sort of antagonistic battle of forces. I think he does kind of see it to a certain degree like that. And because of that, you get kind of these, that force, I think, is a good way to understand these things, but also force is that it's a kind of plural aspect that gets kind of bunched into these holes that forms, what we see as individuals, but individuality is never this absolute thing, because these are processes, and this is a process ontology, a process relational ontology. So I think with a process relational ontology, it makes dualism very difficult it makes dualism extremely difficult, because things are naturally kind of flowing into each other. And I think Deleuze makes a very good point in that, for things to interact with each other, they have to be, on some sense, the same plane of existence, the same level, in order to actually interact with each other. Otherwise, you have the problem of interaction. How does matter interact with mind? You can't figure it out, because, really, it doesn't make sense. You have to have them somewhat as a kind of continuum that are just qualitatively different. And I think he's very aware of that, and that's why he kind of attenuates all of these dualisms and just use that as a kind of method rather than a ontology necessarily.
Ed, did you want to say something?
Thank you. I'm responding to more than one comment. On my copy on page 16, on the paragraph that starts "the universe endures," he mentions that it is true that in the universe itself, two opposite movements, begging pardon, movements are to be distinguished, as we shall see later on, descent and ascent. The first only unwinds, but the ascending movement, which corresponds to the inner work of ripening or creating, endures, essentially imposes its rhythm on the first. So I was thinking of that when Chase was talking about the two principles. And then the idea of this mass and matter and mind, there was on the next page, two different paragraphs when he says the bodies we perceive are, so to speak, cut out of the stuff of nature by our perception. I mean, that seems to imply that we're making the separation by our analytics, by how we're analyzing. But the body which is to perform this action, the body which marks out upon matter the design of its eventual actions, even before they are actual. I mean, he's talking about a living body, right? He's talking about a material, corporeal entity. And then again, in that next paragraph, he says, well, the subdivision of matter into separate bodies is relative to our perception, while the building up of closed off systems of material points is relative to our science. The living body has been separated and closed off by nature herself. So that last sentence confuses me because I thought he was going along a certain path. And then when he says, but the living body has been separate and closed off by nature itself, it seems to me nature is external, right, to us. But anyway, I just thought I'd just throw out those quotations.
So I think that brings up something that we didn't really get to mention that I think would be helpful to kind of give a little more background. I think he does a really good job in these kind of first few pages or so. He kind of gives a summary of his previous books of Time and Free Will and Matter and Memory. So so his idea of perception, I think it is pretty unique, and also I think is pretty important to understand kind of what he's saying. So his idea of perception is that it's not necessarily that you have a little internal representation in your head of what's going on outside. He sees perception as something that's subtractive from any kind of data that you would be receiving. So it's more like your brain is kind of like a filter or a reducing valve that doesn't add anything. It takes away what it sees as extraneous information and gives you an image based off of, a kind of evolutionary practicality of what can I actually interact with, what it's geared towards future action. So I think he's going to make this more explicit later on, but I think this is very important for his whole understanding of evolution and of life, is this general tendency of perception to act as a kind of filter. And also, I think it's interesting to see that this is it's also kind of somewhat of a forerunner. I mean, I know that the idea of intentionality was around, Brentano and whatnot earlier, but this is also a kind of idea of intentionality, which is kind of interesting to see how, later on you have, I know there's a lot of somewhat of a antagonism between phenomenology and what Bergson's ideas were, that Husserl and Bergson kind of disagreed on a lot of things. But I think it's interesting to see that he has a kind of idea of intentionality that's fundamental to his idea of perception. And I mean, I'm not an expert exactly on the relations of Bergson and Husserl and phenomenology and all that, although I think it's interesting to, as we saw with Merleau-Ponty, that Bergson was a huge influence on him. But I think that itself is kind of interesting and also important so that we kind of understand exactly what he's talking about with this evolution of life itself as a kind of, way of selecting things that work for it so that it can just continue its process as a living organism and whatnot.
Right. I don't remember where, Chase, but he actually talks about something about I thought he was talking about biological beings, us human beings, of when we're passing through different states, or when I don't want to use the word evolving, but when we're enduring over time, it's to get us to better able to function in our environment. Do you remember that? That jumped out at me, because that was, I wasn't necessarily expecting that. Maybe that's why it jumped out at me, but it's like, oh, so we're actually reacting, we're adapting to, we're understanding, and then modifying our behavior in the face of this environment or environments.
Yeah, and then he says that essentially that's where the intellect came from, because the intellect is geared towards matter, towards solid bodies that have the tendency to be kind of like billiard balls, because that's generally what our action tends to be based around. So I thought that was interesting too. That's why he says, in the introduction, basically we can't take something, this partial kind of, I don't want to say maybe emergent phenomena of the intellect from evolution to then kind of explain so much the process that led toward it, because itself is kind of a partial thing that is a product of this selection, this reduction of it through our particularly human perception. So I think that's interesting. Also, it actually kind of goes into what we were talking about with Borges and Toulon and all that, and the danger of expanding human systems of thought to the totality. He's basically saying the same thing. I think it's towards the beginning. Let me see. I think it's in the introduction. Yeah, it's in the introduction, at least on my copy, which is the Dover one. It's XII, which is 7. So he basically says here that mechanistic idea of it, which the understanding will always give us, an idea necessarily artificial and symbolical, since it makes the total activity of life shrink to the form of a certain human activity, which is only a partial and local manifestation of life, a result or byproduct of the vital process. We should have to do so indeed if life had employed all blah, blah, blah. But anyways, I think it makes an interesting point that this totalizing of the intellect is a very kind of anthropocentric projection almost to give to the totality of things. And instead, that's why we need to include these other modes of understanding, like the intellect and whatnot. Not the intellect, the intuition.
Right.
Well, we're 10 after 4. Any final comments? Oh, well, thank you again. And if you, does anyone have any comments on how the process worked as far as acknowledging? I mean, if you...
Can I just ask for next time, maybe if I could get like an idea of where everyone is ending that doesn't reference page numbers could be helpful. So if anybody has...
What version are you using, Brad?
I'm using the Modern Library Classics Edition.
And do y'all have like section headings?
Yeah.
Like we can see our section headings on the top.
Yeah.
I was going to recommend, I don't know, like, I mean, most of the sections in this were like 1 to like 7 pages for us. I don't know if it would be ridiculous, but I'm wondering if through the section headings or through like the paragraph breaks, we could number our paragraphs. I don't know if that would end up being too much, but
I have
what I'll try to do is, I mean, this may not be fine-grained enough, but I'll go through and look at these section headings. So, Brad, you do have the section headings.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll go through that reading list, the dated reading list, and put the section headings in it, which may not be a perfect, it's not very fine-grained, but at least it'll give you some idea of where we're at.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think...
I probably should have broken it on section headings, but I didn't think to do that.
I think people having different translations is a bane of all study groups, ultimately. So, I mean, I don't think, anybody has to, put in too much time, but, I think just a general, section heading and maybe, this is 3 paragraphs into biology and philosophy or something. I think that'd be helpful.
Okay. I'll try to modify that reading guide for that.
So one last, he sends me the videos, and then I am gonna upload them to YouTube, and I think I'm gonna going to send them on the email that sends out the Zoom link to each one. I think that's just probably the most convenient way to do it.
Wait, say that again? You're going to send out a link to the...
Yeah, so I'm going to send the link out on the email that the Zoom link was on as a reply to that.
Okay, and as a general comment, we don't have a Canvas page or a Tracks page or anything. I could probably set that up, but if any of you want to send out anything on that email list, it's not like sacrosanct. I don't, so, use your own judgment, but, you guys can send stuff out on there as well.
So that's all, because I would like to sometimes just send out if I stumbled over an article, especially for the Borges things, which I'm more familiar with. I'd love to share it with people. So
yeah, that's fine.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Like I said, I am more of a sort of a administrator, secretary here. So, okay, well, we'll see you next week then. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
See you.